What's that? Who there? Whoa.
All right, guys, I've got Bilal Zaidi, the founder of Creator Lab, here with me. Bilal, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me on, dude. I know we've been chatting over Twitter and even the Clubhouse room, so good to finally do this face-to-face, in air quotes.
It's been a while in the making, for sure. So I'm pumped to dive into it. You have an amazing background, and I think what I love to do on the show, similar to what you do on yours, is get really, really tactical on different things you've learned. So we'll definitely get there with Creator Lab as well. But I just want to get started, with your background. So you, as a kid, got into entrepreneurship pretty early. You had an e-commerce store. You had a massive Arsenal fan set at one point. And I'd love, for people who haven't heard the story, I'd love for you to just educate listeners on that part of your life, and then we can pull out some of those threads.
Yeah, for sure, man. Yeah, so I guess my background, I'm based in New York right now, but as you can probably tell, and I'm pointing out the window because I'm in Brooklyn and there's probably going to be sirens and noise in a bit, but that's part of the fun of doing this during this time. But as you can tell, I'm originally from London, from my accent, but I've been in the States for about 8 years now. But if we go back all the way to around like 16 years old, just before that, actually, I was the kind of kid at school that sold a bunch of stuff. So from SIM cards to hats to iced out watches, don't laugh. I was like 13 and it was like the G Unit era. So that was kind of like what I could get my hands on at the time. So yeah, I would just basically sell anything I could get my hands on that I was interested in. And that manifested from being something I did in the playground to eventually selling on eBay and then an e-commerce store that I ran from 16 years old through college. And so that was like the first kind of taste of real online entrepreneurship, if you want to call it that. It was definitely not like a multi-million-dollar business, but it helped me pay for a lot of college and taught me a lot of skills that kind of helped me along the way after that as well.
Yeah. Yeah. So one of the things I was gonna bring up is this idea of this kind of switch flipping in your head to entrepreneurship. So for me, my family ran a golf course and I grew up on that golf course and I was exposed to my grandparents and thinking about entrepreneurship and little things here and there. And I feel like when that switch flipped in my brain when I was 10 to 12, I always thought about things that way, right? Always looking for ideas, looking for opportunities. And it sounds like that switch flip for you as well. I'm curious why do you feel like you got into that stuff? Did you see stories about successful entrepreneurs? You emulated them, or was it just for money? Or talk us through that a little bit.
Yeah, I've thought about this a lot recently because I think there's a story you tell yourself as a kid or like early adult, and then over time you realize things you've forgotten. So one of the things was, look, we definitely weren't like poor, but my parents they were like immigrant from Pakistan, landed in the UK. So yeah, considering compared to the rest of the UK, they were definitely like working class in the beginning and kind of went eventually to like working middle class eventually. But my dad, when he came to the country, he worked in a factory, he worked in KFC, like any odd job he could find. My mum did like machine work at home and all this sort of stuff. Eventually my dad ended up in a bank and like did okay, but we never made more than like 40 grand a year in our household. So that's kind of just to paint a picture of that world. I didn't really know much else beyond that though, right? Because it's just my friends and my cousins that I'm like meeting. I never really met anyone who made a bunch of money. So I would look to the TV and see like, oh, that person's a millionaire, and be like, oh, wow, they're so rich. And now, like, to me, like a millionaire is not even that crazy. Because,
you can't do anything.
Yeah, you can't even do that much nowadays. But yeah, I think it came from like seeing those examples, and the hunger probably came from, I guess, like not having that much. I definitely felt really lucky compared to my parents and even my brother and sister before me. But there were times, to be really frank, like at my school, like I got called like poor by like idiot kids. Like, even though we weren't any poorer than other people, it was just like at one point we were on free school meals at school, where we were getting basically like form of welfare. So I think coming from that background, comparing that to today, where most of my friends are, they're pretty comfortable, at least, if not most of them are probably millionaires as well by the time they've like grown in their careers and their net worth has grown. And so I guess like I've also kind of forgotten a lot about those early years where I was thinking, okay, like it'll be great to make £20, like from this hat sale, because that's going to pay for my whole my week's worth of, like lunch or whatever. So it just came from like not having too much. And I found it kind of like a game, it was something I was naturally kind of good at, like seeing an opportunity and convincing someone that, hey, I've got this thing you'd like, and essentially selling it to them. So I think that's where it came from, man. No one in my family was like that. So I'm not sure. It wasn't like your story.
Yeah, I love it though. It's when you're underrated and got that fire when people are making fun of you. There's no better driving force than that.
Completely. I was actually listening to Chamath Palihapitiya, the investor, this morning, and definitely not exactly the same story. I'm not a billionaire like him, but
not yet.
Not yet. I mean, he's got a few years on me, but it really was resonating because some of the same things he was talking about coming from that immigrant family, like you kind of get taught these personal finance things early on. Like for my dad, I would sit with him when I was like 9 years old and look at a spreadsheet of our monthly bills. And like he would show me kind of how to balance the books, and I would see a row that said overdraft. Like every month there'll be an overdraft, and I didn't know at the time that wasn't like a good thing or normal.
Yeah, that was not good.
And it wasn't a good thing. So just seeing those sorts of things made me think from early on, like, oh, there's incomes and outgoings. Like, how do we make sure we're not too wild and spending crazy money, and just understanding like basic finance stuff at quite a young age.
Yeah. So after you ran the e-com store, you went to university, and then you ended up at Google. And I think, as I was reflecting on your path, it's similar in ways to mine. And I think like there's probably several archetypes, but there's two main archetypes in my mind for people who end up doing their own thing and becoming entrepreneurial. One is kind of the misfit who's always an entrepreneur. They can never stand working for a big company for like more than a day or two, and then they're always doing stuff. The other, which I think you and I fall into, or I'm aspiring to, is you have experience with entrepreneurship early on. You ultimately go work for a big company for a little while. Then you find a way to run kind of like a startup-y group, or you act like a startup internally. And then once you can't take it anymore, you leave and you start your own thing that way. And so I'd love for you to just reflect on your career arc. And I was, doing research for this, and you mentioned how important Google was and that experience was to shaping your mentality. So just go through that a bit.
Yeah, definitely, man. I'd say like it was very similar to what you said, but I think I started with that young, kind of like, oh, I'm not going to work for anyone sort of attitude. So when I was 16 to 18 doing A-levels in the UK, I was making decent money coming in from the e-commerce store. I'd be in class getting email pings that like someone bought a £20 hat, someone bought a XYZ. And at that stage, I was like, well, this is what I'm going to do, right? Like what? Like I'm already making more money than most people I know. So I was like, I didn't know that much, but at that age, you think you do, right? So I almost didn't go to university for that reason, because I said to my parents, like, I'm already doing this. Why am I going to go to university? Let me just keep doing it. And thankfully, they were like, no. You're going to university. This is maybe not what you're doing forever. So I would just say that was slightly different for me, where I kind of had this raw thing that came out of wherever that was all about I want to do this eventually. So by the time I landed at Google, I actually wasn't looking for a job at Google either. It was straight after college. And thankfully I got reached out to by a recruiter from Google, and given the e-commerce experience and the other SEO stuff I'd done, I was kind of a relevant candidate. And by the time I kind of spoke to them after a few times, I was like, okay, this is going to be great for me. So let me just go and learn, and then I can leave in a year or two. And then, like most things you start, it doesn't end up like that. So I ended up staying for 7 years, 7.5 years. And to your question, like I kind of went there with the attitude of, I'm just going to go and meet great people. I'm going to have the brand of Google behind me. That's going to help me in 2 years when I start a company again. But then the more you learn, the more you realize, actually, there's so much more I need to learn. So that's why I kept moving every 2-3 years. I moved offices, ended up in New York, changed roles. And then, like you said, I started looking for those other opportunities. So I left the big part of Google and went to essentially a startup in Google, which was an amazing experience, starting from zero. And then eventually moved to the States and started the podcast. And then from Google, I ended up going to a place called Charity War, which was less than 100 people. So not a startup, but like kind of like a startup as well. And that was always like towards my plan of long term, I want to go and work for myself. How can I make sure the next step is going to help me get closer to that? So that's kind of how it progressed.
Yeah. And so during your time at Google, I mean, you were there during a crazy time, right? You saw YouTube go from, it was still relatively big when you got there, but it was massive when you left, and Android 4 to 80% market adoption. Like what were some of when you were sitting there with a first class seat to those things happening, was it clicking in your mind at that time? Like, whoa, there's going to be, because I think the wave of the creator economy was really starting at that time, right?
Yeah, completely, man. And that's the big thing. The stats you just shared there, like Android 4 to 80%. That's the stuff that I feel like even my friends who are at Google now, a lot of them aren't even clued into that stuff now because they're just doing their core job. And there's nothing wrong with that. They've got families by now and they make a good living and they're just trying to avoid doing too much work. But when you're 21 or 25, it's very different, right? Like you're there to learn and you're absorbing all this information. So I would like go out of my way to like meet people in different teams, reach out to people in like Mountain View when I was in Dublin and say like, hey, I saw you're working on, I don't know if I'm allowed to say what it was called internally, but what became Google Plus. And like, I'm curious, like what is this? Or like the Google Glasses. This was nothing to do with my job, right? But it was, I mean, in one way it was because the people I worked with from the client side were looking to me as an expert in digital. So in my eyes, it was my job to know all of this stuff and to represent Google wherever I went. So but just to go into YouTube and Android as an example, like it's very unlikely I'll ever be able to see again a platform go from 4% to 8% market share and get a weekly email of all the things they were working on, from partnerships to like legal problems. And it was quite an open culture at the time. And then on the YouTube side, it was even crazier in a way because like even the people at Google didn't realize how big it was going to become, Like we all knew it was like great from, the people are using video and YouTube's the biggest video platform. But, in terms of like seeing a small YouTuber become, selling out an arena for a boxing match, which is happening now. Like that's literally KSI, who I'm thinking of from the UK, but also Logan Paul and his brother. They're all doing this nowadays. So it's just a crazy thing. And I think fast forward 10 years from now, I think we're going to see even more of that, from YouTubers to podcasters to Substack writers. There's so many interesting ways to do it nowadays.
Yeah. And I definitely want to get into those things as well. So shifting a little bit to the Creator Lab, the impetus to start. So you started it in 2015 when you were at Google still, I think.
Yeah.
And just talk me through and we'll go through, because I think there's been several waves of it, right? And I want to get into all that. But talk me through when you started it, because it was still kind of early days for podcasting. What was your vision and what was kind of your impetus to get started?
Yeah, for me, it was always like I loved interviews. And again, in hindsight, I can see I loved interviews on TV. Like I'd watch them every weekend with my dad. And I just love like hearing people's stories. The first book I ever read on my own accord that wasn't like Shakespeare for school was Richard Branson's Autobiography. And I loved it. I fell in love with reading from that moment onwards. And so I just always loved people's stories. And for me, going back to that early childhood situation, it was my way, one, for my imagination to go and dream, but also for me to say, oh, cool, that's a playbook someone else used. I can just copy this. Like I can do something they did and remix it. Or like Richard Branson started a student magazine, I remember still, right? And like that is something many people who I've interviewed did an equivalent of that. And I've got my own version of that. So just seeing examples of how other people did it just made such a huge difference to my own life. And I thought, by this stage, I was already at Google for 5 years. I was had built a name for myself within Google internally to a certain extent as being someone interested in startups and that sort of stuff. So outside of work, I was already making these relationships with people and having these conversations anyway. I was meeting them for coffee, going for drinks, having food or whatever. And I would have some of these conversations and I would look to myself and say, this would be amazing if I just recorded this, because we talked about all this inside stuff that you don't really hear on many podcasts. So obviously now there's so many great ones, but at the time, 2015, the one that I looked to the most was Tim Ferriss. But even Tim Ferriss, he was more about the personal story, and he's not just business focused, right? So for me, it was like, I want to do partly what he's doing, but for business specifically. And the difference is Tim Ferriss, he has a background in business, but that was like 20 years ago by this point. He's been an author since then. My angle was always, I'm not a real journalist. I'm just like you. I'm someone who already works with people like you, and I can get in the nuts and bolts of things that a normal journalist probably couldn't, because they don't have the context or experience to talk about it. So I was really creating it for myself to say, I don't see these conversations. Let me go and have them. And selfishly, it was a way for me to get in the room with people that I otherwise wouldn't get time with, and you know this yourself, right? Like the fact that we can sit here, and not that I'm that important to not talk for 2 hours with me already, but like whoever else you've interviewed in the past, to sit for 1 or 2 hours with someone and ask them about their childhood and all these random things. If we were having a coffee right now and you talk to me about my childhood, it'd be kind of weird, right?
Yeah, like,
so
I gotta
it's
get
just
out
like
of here.
there's a certain level of conversation you can have, and I wanted to do that myself.
Yeah, it's very similar for me. I mean, you've had some massive names, and I mean, you've definitely built an established brand now. But I mean, for me to even think about getting in the door with some of those people, you could never do that other than a medium like this, where they're getting some kind of social benefit, which is amazing. So, and I want to get into tactically around the podcast as well. But one question before that, just around the ebbs and flow of the Creator Lab story. So it sounds like you had a pretty good vision, and there was a lot of white space in what you described, right? Like Tim Ferriss angle, but from someone who's not an insider, but kind of has these relationships. I love that. And so when you look back at the journey, it looks like you were kind of intermittent. You still had high profile guests from the beginning, but you were intermittently posting until like
there
last
were
fall.
Big gaps.
Yeah. What was happening with that?
So what happened was, when I first started it, I had a full-time job, right? So I recorded, I think, 10 episodes up front, so that I had enough to launch every week or whatever the cadence was I planned. And then as soon as I launched, I was like, oh my God, there's so much work that goes into this. And you know this as much as I do. And for people who don't have a podcast listening, just to give you a really quick snapshot, like I might prepare 5 to 10 hours prep for an interview. The editing might take, like I just got an invoice from my editor yesterday, 10 hours of editing for one episode, including clips and all these other things that we cut. And, everyone isn't doing it at that level, but like, that's the way I'm approaching it. And of course, recording and then promoting it after. It's like, could be a full-time job. So when I started doing that, I realized very quickly I needed to focus in. So that's why I only did audio, not video. And after a few months of doing that, maybe 9 months, I can't remember exactly, it just kind of took over my life. And actually what happened is I left Google and I joined Charity War after meeting the founder on the podcast. So that was the big time where I had to like give it a bit of a chill pill, because, it was a completely brand new job. I needed to focus 150% on that. It's also a non-profit, so I didn't want to be there like wasting their time, me doing stuff on the side. So I wanted to really hone in on that. But it was always there on the side, and then I kept it going as much as I could. And then eventually, when I left full time to go work for myself full time 2 years ago, that's one of the main reasons, was because I wanted to focus more on doing the podcast, or at least integrate it within my overall mix of work and my life, because I enjoyed it so much. So that's when I could fully commit to it. And actually, I did it intermittently from the first period of being self-employed, because again, I was trying to figure stuff out. I was trying to see how I could fit it in, but also earn money. And because it did earn some money at the time through sponsorships, but it wasn't enough to replace my salary. And so I started doing consultancy. So again, it was always this like balancing act. And then the last part, in August last year, 2020, after 4 or 5 years of doing it, I said, okay, I'm going to treat this like a job. Like I'm going to do this basically like half my time, and I'm going to commit to one a week. I'm not going to miss an episode. I said it publicly to a guy called Trung who writes for Trends, and he wrote it in the Trends newsletter. So like it was in there. It's going to be every Wednesday, and I was like, okay, I got to stick to this now. And yeah, that's what really helped. It's just me committing to it, and I haven't missed one since, except for like Christmas Day or something like that.
Yeah, no, you've been a force since then for sure.
Thanks, man.
The show's amazing, and it really is. Like people who don't, they think these podcasts are easy to produce. They're not easy to produce. There's so much that goes into it, and so I appreciate you shedding the transparency, because I think there's a lot of people out there. So right, I have a full-time job, 45, 50 hours a week, and then do this on top, and it's brutal. It's brutal to try to do it all. Yeah,
and if you've got like, let's say I don't know your situation, but if you've got a relationship that you're trying to balance, or like you've got family to look after, or there's all sorts of things. So there's a certain you need to be able to carve out time for it. The one thing I will add though is, for some people you can do it in a much more streamlined way, but the way I think me and you are, we like to do things very, like if we're going to do it, we're going to go all out. So there's a balance between high quality work and perfection. So I try not to just strive for perfection, but like something very good that I'm going to be proud of. And maybe we can talk about that later, but there's a balance between like frequency and making sure it's worth the time and effort for the listener as well.
Yeah. I was doing everything from the editing and everything for the first like 35 episodes, and it was taking 20 hours a week or so.
Takes over your life.
Yeah. And so luckily I've got an editor as well, he's amazing. And he has a team that does a lot of the heavy lift for the audio and video, which is helpful. I don't think it's possible for someone to do a high quality video and audio themselves with a full-time job. I think the quality would suffer.
It's difficult. Completely, man. Yeah, I agree.
Yeah. So I want to shift to, and I think this is right on thread, to tactical pieces about the podcast. And I think the reason I want to push on this, both because you have one and I have one as well, but I think there's a lot of people out there that these lessons can be applicable for with creating anything, right? Getting started and building it. So the first piece I wanted to touch on was getting guests. You've had amazing guests from the beginning. And I think my approach was always, okay, do whatever I can to get a couple of key big name guests and then use them to credentialize yourself when you go to other guests. And that seemed to have worked well. But getting those big guests at the beginning when you have no credibility is brutal. It's tough to do. And
it's tough.
Yeah, I'd love for you to talk through, what were some of the different approaches that you used that worked? And let's get really tactical for people and try to give them some tips.
Yeah, I'll try to share as many examples as I can. And I'll preface this by saying, this was in 2015, 2016 when I first did it. So obviously by 2021, a lot of these people are getting hit up with lots of requests. So it might be a different approach if you're starting from scratch today. But I'd say I'd bucket them into a couple main categories. One is cold outreach. The second is warm outreach, which is much better if you can get to that stage. And then the third one, I'd say I'd group that into like a one-to-many approach. So I'll go for each one. I'll quickly, let's say cold first, right? Cold is when you're first starting out, you have no network, you're just starting from scratch. That is, and I hate to use this phrase because people take it out of context, but that's just straight hustle, right? Like you're DMing people, you're cold emailing, you're getting rejected 97% of the time, or whatever the number is. You're basically falling on your face, and it hurts your ego, and it's tough. So that's where everyone has to kind of start. So I'll give a couple of examples in a second, but just to summarize, the second one is warm, which is going through your current network, or once you get guests, you can ask them for intros. That's obviously a much better approach if you can get to that stage. And then the third one is, one to many. So this means creating relationships with people who have access to other multiple potential guests for you. So that could be investors, it could be publishers for a book, our other podcasters, PR is another one, exactly. And so I think that one's kind of self-explanatory, but the cold one, I'll go into a couple of examples. So the first guest I ever got was a guy called Cenk Uygur from the Young Turks. So he's a huge guest. That was a really big one to get. I didn't own a microphone. I didn't have a podcast. I just about had a name, I think. I think I had registered a domain name, and I'd been procrastinating because, you've got your job, life takes over, and you're like, oh, one day I'm going to do this thing. So I met this guy at an event, And at this moment, I thought, oh, I've actually been following his stuff for some time. And for context, he's got like one of the biggest YouTube channels. It's like 10 billion views, the biggest news channel on the internet. They're like a left-leaning kind of news channel. So I'd seen his stuff for ages. And working at Google and YouTube, they always use them as an example. So I saw him at this event, had a conversation. And that was one of the first times I actually just like cold pitched and asked straight up. And I said, but I didn't have anything to pitch. So what did I do? I basically, first I created some rapport, but then I basically tried to hone into a seed of an idea that I'd planted earlier, which was you or me once upon a time. And I was saying to him like, well, yeah, I've got this idea. I'm trying to interview people, share their story, X, Y, Z. And like he thought about it and he was like, okay, yeah, like email me next week. And he whipped out a bunch of cards and they were all other people's cards and he just had one of his own left and he gave it to me. And that was him being nice, right? And now I know in hindsight, and I don't want to bore you with the full story, but like I think it's quite important to share some of the details. The next week, to go more tactical, I send an email, like he said. He adds in his chief of staff and says, okay, we'll see if we can make it happen. She says, sorry, yeah, he doesn't have any time at the moment, which is fair enough. So at that moment, I said, okay, cool. I appreciate you getting back. Would love to stay in touch. Maybe in a few months, we can touch base again. How's your summer going? And that was just me being kind of nice or something along those lines. And she replied and said, thanks for asking. I'm actually getting married in a few months. And we had these emails back and forth. And I checked the other day, I had 43 emails with this chief of staff. And by the end, she sent me her wedding photos. And the reason I shared that anecdote is one, because it's kind of funny, but also because, you know, that's kind of what it took. Like she did me a huge favor eventually by getting me in his calendar. And that was because I was genuinely nice. I gave someone who often gets ignored all the time, like the time of day. And I basically asked something, and that is often what it takes early on. You need a bit of a break. And, you know, so that was one example. And I'll pause there because I don't want to keep going unless you want me to give other examples.
No, those are great. Yeah, I'm open to more examples as well. I was going to layer on, so like what I did for this show, because I started right at the beginning of COVID. So I had no in-person potential interaction at all. So it was all remote. And so I made a list of 50 companies and founders that I liked. And I tried to prioritize them, like, okay, out of 10, how hard would it be to get these, just based on like how high profile I felt like they were. And then I said, okay, I think I made a list of 100. And I said 4 days in a row, I'm going to send 25 emails each day.
Oh, wow.
But for every single email, I tried to customize the top and say like something I really liked about them, something I really liked about their business. I think I sent the first 25 and I only got 2 responses, but I landed those 2. And then since then, every single guest, like a tradition on the show is that they kind of refer, and it's a warm intro trick, but they refer one of someone that's in their network, and that's how I've been going. And you know, amazing. You have to send those cold emails a lot, but that's, you know, you have to customize them and really like give them the due time that they deserve.
Completely, man. Yeah, no, I love to hear that story, man, because that's kind of what it takes. And a lot of people, like there's even examples where I'll give one more recent one, Sean Puri from Twitch, who has got another podcast, My First Million. He hosts with Sam Parr from The Hustle. And this guy, I'd spoken to him on the phone basically before he had a podcast. And I was like trying to help him out with one thing and he was helping me out with something. So I even had his phone number and he said yes over DM to like, yeah, I'll do the show with you. And then he just went like quiet, right?
Yeah.
It went cold and it's because he's getting 1,000 DMs. So like so I didn't take it personally, but there's also an art to follow up, right? And one of the things I did was I didn't let it hit my ego. I just said, okay, cool. He's busy. So am I, but I'm going to reach back out. And each time I reached back out, I think it took like 3 or 4 times, I said, hey man, I hope everything's well. In fact, maybe I even skipped that by the end because I was trying to keep it short and sweet. I would give an update. I'd say, oh, since we last spoke, I booked Tim Urban. He's got #1 TED Talk in the world. Your co-host, Sam Parr, we recorded last week. And I would give him enough kind of tailored messaging to say, I'm still moving forward. I'd love to have you join this rocket ship, come aboard, and and eventually it works. And we had a great conversation. But I think a lot of people don't realize how much of that it takes to just keep going back and forth with people and not to be annoying and actually add value in that interaction and to say, like, here's an update. I think that's a key thing as well.
Yeah. Most people, and to put a pin in it, most people aren't willing to put in the work to, all right, do all those outreaches cold, track them all, follow up in a consistent cadence, be willing to say no, like get the no's. It's tough. It's a lot of work.
Can I ask a question, actually? What's your main day job then? Are you in sales by any chance?
No, so I kind of actually, I work in consulting, but I run kind of a small startup group within Deloitte Consulting.
Oh, cool.
So I'm selling a lot during the day, but yeah, it's a huge, suck on my time. And so it's really tough to, because the other thing is when you send these, and I know we're getting really tactical, but when you send these cold emails, you kind of have to send them during the workday for these people to respond because a lot of founders have really regimented schedules and they get offline at 5, 6, 7 p.m. So if you waited until the end of your workday, they're going to miss it. It's going to get buried in their inbox. So you kind of have to find a way to kind of either pre-program them or something like that to get them through the day.
Schedule it out or whatever. Yeah.
So
that's great.
Yeah. And I feel like we could jam on this forever on the podcast logistics.
Whatever you want to chat about, man. It's all good.
Yeah. So one question just in your reflection. So I know since you started going consistent, I know your show has grown consistently big time over the last, few months. Yeah. I wonder, what do you think are the biggest reasons for why it's, what's moved the needle for the growth other than just the consistent cadence?
Yeah, I'd say there's a couple things. One, I think the consistent cadence is a really big part of it, which is an obvious answer, but it's not just like doing it consistently, like keep churning out stuff. It's doing it at a certain level that people can expect to know, oh, every time they come and listen to Creator Lab, there's going to be a top guest. I've already done the filtering process for you that that is someone worthwhile listening to. And like this, and I've combed through the conversation enough that the quality is very high. The signal or whatever you want to call it is pretty high. And then the other big thing is I started posting elsewhere and leveraging other channels like Twitter, for example. So I always had Twitter, but I would just use it as a channel to like post the episode with like no followers, right? So I had to really commit on one channel. That's something I learned from Anthony Pompliano. I had him on the show and we talked about building an audience first empire. He's got to like 500,000 plus followers now. And what a lot of people see is the end result with him, right? They see, oh, he's got 500,000 followers and a big podcast and a YouTube show and 100,000 plus email subscribers. What they don't realize a lot of the time is he did one channel at a time. And especially in early stages, you really need to concentrate your efforts, I think, in one or two channels. So maybe it's one primary channel where you record. So for us, it's a podcast long form, and then another primary channel where people that we're trying to attract hang out. So, for me, that's Twitter. I think it's probably the same for you. For other people, that might be LinkedIn. For someone else, it might be Instagram or YouTube. And so I do put stuff on YouTube, but I haven't like perfected that by any means. I haven't really optimized enough for it. So my big channel has been leveraging guests, audiences on Twitter, also posting consistently myself, not just about the podcast, but in general, ideas, business stuff I'm interested in, and building up a tiny following. I've got like 5,000 followers or something. So for me, that helps in the long run, because instead of me like skimming myself everywhere and posting on Instagram, I haven't even posted on Instagram for ages now, though like I do want to get to that eventually. So I'd say, yes, posting consistently, then using something like Twitter to get in front of more people in the discovery side. And key to that is not just the promotion part, is what am I promoting? You follow my stuff, right? There's these clips, and it's giving people an appetizer before the main course. So I'm saying to them, all right, this person you're following, Paulina, Pomp, Jack Butcher, whoever, you're already following them. Now they're sharing a clip, 1 or 2 minutes worth, and they don't know me. They don't like care about who I am. So I need to give them something snackable that is entertaining enough or useful that piques their interest. And then a small percentage of them will actually go through to the podcast. And then I need to do that hundreds of times. So it's just, a marketing funnel. It's like awareness at the top, impressions, then your mid funnel, getting clicks. and then retaining those people is like also the hard part, I guess.
Yeah, we make similar clips, but I think the issue for me is I'm in the boat where you were, which is the following is so small that you're blasting it out to almost no one, and so you do rely on your guests helping you amplify that if they have bigger audiences.
No, and I think you do great writing, and I follow you, and I think I can see you're putting in so much effort and work. So I think the quality of your content is high. I think what happens, especially in the beginning, is you need and this is just my opinion, I'm definitely not an expert, but from my experience in speaking to others, there's they're doing things that don't scale, but more specifically beyond a phrase, it's that's I DM, especially in the beginning, I DM almost everyone who follows me. Now I don't do that as much because it's a little bit harder. I've replied to all the DMs. If you I only have 5,000 followers, and I get quite a lot of DMs now because of the podcast. Because on the podcast I say, hey, let me know on Twitter, and that helps. And it's just in fact, there's other people who I DM'd cold because they mentioned another podcast or something, and I shared, hey, I saw you like this. I built on this conversation here. It's all the stuff I learned about SEO 10 years ago. That's how you build links, So it's all of those things. And then another big thing I'll share is speaking to those people offline. It's not very scalable, but jumping on a quick Zoom call, or what we've been doing, jumping in a Clubhouse room, that you get some FaceTime or whatever with those people, and when you show up on their feed next time, they're going to be more likely to engage. So that's not the reason to do it, but it helps in your overall goals too.
Yeah, no, those relationships are so much stickier when you go out of your way to do those things. I totally agree. So a question I was going to run by you, and I'd love to get your take on this, is imagine Creator Lab was gone. We'll say the founder's gone as well. It's 2021, and podcasts and long form content's busy, right? The landscape has never been. There's never been more shows. So if you had to start from scratch now, where do you think? What do you think's compelling? Could be topic matter, format, length, platform. What are your thoughts there?
Yeah, I'd say the first thing I would do is clarify my goal, because I think a lot of people assume the goal is create something that's really big with a big following. Whereas, of course, we all want that. But really, for me, I would start by that, because for me, the goal is primarily meet great people, have great conversations, learn from those conversations that they're worthwhile on their own. And if people listen, that's the second tier. And I'm proactively trying to grow that. But I have to stack rank those first, because just to give another example, the nuance of it is, if it was the other way around, if my primary goal was to create something with a big audience, I would do what Nathan Latka does, which is do 20-minute episodes and record 15 of them in one day, and ask them all to share it out and game the system there. And that's great for him, and I'm not against him doing that, but it's not for me, right? That's not what I'm optimizing for. So that's just the one thing I'd say. So assuming is my current goals, which are both to grow an audience, but also have high quality stuff that I learn from and create those relationships, I would think, where are those people hanging out? And so, I'd say if you're picking a new topic, I think for something like a podcast, it needs to be something you're genuinely interested in. I think for a business, that's not always the case. Your interest in business might be, I like creating a business, and I've met many people like that. But for a podcast, if you're going to actually speak about something for hours, you better enjoy what you're talking about. So I'd start with that. So for me, it would either be, again, entrepreneurship, business related, maybe it'd be sports related. If I was trying to make money, I would go the B2B route, and I'd think about what are the areas where I could only have 100 people listening, but those 100 people are worth a lot more money because they're spending thousands of dollars on consultancy, on agency fees, on software, etc. So yeah, that's about choosing a category. Then I would think about, length. To me, I'll answer that really quickly. I don't really have, I'm not as dogmatic about short form, long form, hour-long caps. That makes sense if you're trying to grow long-term to a massive audience. Yeah, that makes sense. But also Joe Rogan, Tim Ferriss, and a lot of the biggest podcasts have 3-hour episodes. But the key thing is, the 3 hours isn't what makes it good. It's it's just really good, and it happens to be 3 hours. So I think that's where a lot of people kind of say, oh, well, he's doing it, I can do it too. And I'd say if you're starting in 2021, shorter is probably better in terms of like an hour. I don't mean like 20 minutes, because I don't think a conversation for 20 minutes in an interview form, I don't think you can get really any real insight. It's normally just a pitch, and so I don't find that interesting. And then lastly, I would pick a distribution channel or a channel where there's an audience already that I can go and be a part of. And like I would spend 30 days building up, answering questions, replying to people, just being useful, DMing people, doing all that unscalable stuff that's super annoying and tiring. And I would probably pick Twitter generally, because it allows for text, there's images, there's video. And the other key thing is your tweet can reach, like, let's say you've got 1,000 followers, your tweet can still reach 50,000 people sometimes if it like kind of spreads into other secondary networks. On Instagram, that doesn't happen as much anymore. It used to when people used the Discover feed before it was like filled with thirst traps. Like, you know, so it's like, so again, but for some people, lifestyle content, it might work better there. The other thing I'd throw in, I'd say Clubhouse is very interesting to me, or this Twitter Spaces, whatever it becomes. If you're doing audio, I think it's worth experimenting in, because you can very quickly be in a place kind of like the town square of Twitter, but for audio. And if you are good at hosting, you're good at bringing people together and giving people space to speak, I think that's an interesting place to be spending a bit more time in, understanding how people add value and following the same playbook. Pick a time, pick a place, and turn up every week and make sure people have a way to follow your journey. I would lastly try to take those people off platform and give them an incentive to sign up for your email newsletter or subscribe to your podcast or whatever. Give them some access that they wouldn't have otherwise. So it's why I did a recent live event with Jack Butcher, because I got a chance to get hundreds of people's email addresses that I can then communicate with in the future. I also wanted to do it for fun, but there was two reasons for that.
Yeah, it was a win-win. I listened to that whole thing. I loved it. That was a great
man,
session.
Thanks for joining. It went a little late, but yeah, it was. Well, actually, sorry, it wasn't late for us, but there was a dude in Pakistan who was there until 4 a.m. It was amazing. So.
He's hustling. I was gonna ask you about the Clubhouse and the Twitter Spaces piece, because it is super compelling to me. I feel like there's probably a way where you can just plug a cord in and record it, so you can rip the audio and post it. So the fact that it's not stored is not a big deal, but it is super compelling that right now it seems like a lot of people are spending all of their free time just jumping in Clubhouse, just listening. And if you can, like you said, if you can capture the right time, the right mix of people, that could be almost like a cheat code to amplify your podcast audience.
Definitely. And one thing, I'll just add more color to what you said. It's like we're talking in February 2021. If you ask me in 2 months, I might have a very different opinion. And that's what is interesting, because it's always just about, especially the way I approach it, is like, where is the attention and where is there, there's clearly lots of attention on Instagram, but there's less opportunity to capitalize on the attention. So there's part one is, where are people hanging out? Part two is, does it align with the sort of stuff I care about? Part three is their discoverability. Am I going to show up in someone's feed or in their corridor in Clubhouse where there's a room of 100 people and they might listen in and hear your name for the first time? I also am still very bullish on YouTube, even though I haven't really optimized enough. Like it's doing pretty well for me. It's grown significantly, but it's not. I post like 2 hour long podcasts on YouTube. That's not really like optimal for building an audience from day one. You really want to do like 10-minute videos, really succinct, share stories or share something that's actionable. So I would love to get to that at some point, but right now I'm really just focused on my current approach.
Yeah, there's just not enough time in the day to make those as well. Yeah. So I was going to ask you about, so I think this isn't a driver in your success, but it's definitely a benefit, is that now that you're self-employed, you're able to dedicate a lot of time, carve out specifically for the podcast. And I think I would give a leg to be able to do that. And I always, every week, think about maybe I should make the jump. But I want to talk about it because I think there's a lot of people out there that they're creating on the side, they've got a full-time job, and they're not able to dedicate the time required to get the quality level. And so for you, when you were setting up your life that you now have, where I know you got the Creator Lab digital consultancy, you do some work half the week, and then you do the podcast. Just talk about how you thought about that, and did you approach getting those deals as almost like a hedge or a way to like make enough money to allow you to do the podcast? Or just talk through how you thought about that.
To a certain extent. And well, for me, the difference is there's someone listening to this who's a pure creative person, and they just want to be a podcaster or a YouTuber or whatever else they care about, writer. And I'm all for that. Like, I love those people. But for me, I had to be honest with myself and say, okay, what am I good at? What do I naturally like? What do I want to spend the next few years doing? I used to do like big 5-10 year plans, and now I just try to do 2-3 year plans and see how I'm feeling. And what I said was, I love variety. I love business. So like, I enjoy being in the game, like working on stuff, whether that's creating my own stuff or helping someone else who's doing something with infrastructure that I can plug in with my skills that I've learned over 10-15 years. So it wasn't something I figured out straight away, to be honest, because when I left Charity Water, the first few months, to be really frank, I didn't earn hardly anything. Like, I didn't have any consultancy clients. I didn't like leave with a big plan. I just said, okay, let me go and spend. I'd saved up, which was part of the like equation, of course. But to put it frankly, I could just share the numbers. I live in New York, so my burn rate every month was like 5-6 grand a month, the way I was currently living, right? And I could afford to do that previously, but when you go from earning like multiple 6-figure salary to zero, it's a big change. So
the water starts coming out of the bucket pretty fast.
Completely.
6 grand a month at a time.
Exactly. So even if you've got like X months or years runway or whatever you've saved, like that starts hitting you mentally. And some people are better at it than others. What I realized was, I'm now going on a defensive, and I don't like that feeling, because you start scraping and you start being like, oh, well, I need to make this work because like now I'm like spending X amount every month and it's coming out my savings or whatever. And I didn't really like that feeling, because I'm someone who does better on the offense when I'm like proactive. And I had to kind of rebalance and say, okay, what can I do? Let me trade some of my time to help someone else. But there's moving from a straight up job where you're paid for your time. And then there's like full out business where you're paid for output or value or whatever. But there's a middle ground, which for me was being paid for a task or being paid for something, my knowledge or whatever, for an output essentially, where I still needed to put my time in on the equation side, but I was being paid not by the hour or whatever. I was being paid monthly to look after a part of a business for a company. So that's kind of what I said. Okay, I need to go and find people who require this service essentially, and I can like. I basically have just had to find the right clients, because I'm also not trying to like grow it to like 100-person agency or something like that. That's not my goal at the moment. So it was a balance of like hedging the time and finding that flexibility where I still gain from doing that work, because I enjoy doing it. Like I don't hate that work at all. I actually enjoy doing it. It keeps my skills nice and sharp. So even if I was to start a company myself, or I would join another one at some point, I'm not like completely out of the game where I've just been like talking into a podcast for a few years. And it just allows me to have more of a flexible life. So this year the last year we've all been like working flexibly anyway. But the year before that, when, before COVID, I was like traveling. So I was in Argentina for 2 months. I was in Mexico City and Europe and whatever. And that was a big part of the equation too, because I wanted to have a life that allowed for those things, earn enough money to pay for it all, and then still do the things I really enjoyed. It was a balance of money and also like the creative passion, the mission, as well as, like I actually like looking at numbers sometimes and doing real business stuff. So it's just like a combination of all those things. So yeah, I hopefully that answered your question, but I think it's really important for people to think about what is in it for them at that particular moment and how that evolves over time.
Yeah, I mean, that's great insight. I love the way you think about it. So, a couple more questions and then we'll shift to some of these another topic. The first one is for you, what does success look like for Creator Lab, let's say 2-3 years down the road? Obviously, you want to grow the audience.
Yeah.
I think people who are starting out, as you mentioned before, it helps to define that goal, right? You're either, people are starting, I'm going to be Joe Rogan, sell for 100 million to Spotify. Like that's unrealistic, right? So it's helpful to map. You could use this as a lead gen for your consultancy business if you wanted to grow that. You could use this to build your.
And I kind of have done that too. That was a part of the kind of equation too. Yeah.
Yeah. So how do you think about that? And you don't have to have all the answers or a plan, but what are you thinking right now?
Yeah, I mean, what's interesting is, so when I hear that question, honestly, how I feel about it is like forever I've had a big long-term plan, and I'm like, oh, I'm going to do this by this age, and then I'm going to, join a startup or start a company and do X, Y, Z. And then what I've really had to fight, and this, is a more of a mental thing, is being more in the present. And like, not to sound too zen, but like I was continuously living for something in the future. And really what I wanted was like day to day. My day-to-day life is what I should have been optimizing for. And maybe, when you're 21, it's different because you do need to get real experience and savings and get in a place where you're financially okay, that you feel comfortable. So maybe at that moment it made sense. But now I'm 32 going on 33. I have some savings. I've worked for some time that I feel confident that I could, if I really needed a job, I could probably go and get one. And if I didn't work with the people I work with now, I could probably find some business to add value to and transact in some way. So, but that takes time, right? So I would say that I don't necessarily have like what would this look like in 3 to 5 years. I have some ideas around like what it could potentially look like, but I don't have a preference for any of them yet. So I'll share a few of those. One is just continue growing, let this podcast be self-sustainable in its own way. But really, I doubt I ever really just want to be like a full-time podcaster. Like, that's cool. I'm not against it for some people, but for me, I like creating stuff. I like being a part of, some form of business. So I think I'll always want to have my foot in the door with some of those things. So maybe that I might evolve from what I currently have, which is consultancy, which is not that bad. Like some people really like shit on it, but like I've found it to be a pretty good experience, but you have to be careful who you work with. But that could evolve to something a bit more scalable, which is potentially like investing. So that's something like I've thought about already, where I meet a lot of great founders and investors. Sometimes I know something about the company before other people do. I create relationships with people. So if I wanted to like double down on that, I feel like that's an interesting area. There's another route, which is more the kind of like solo creator way, which you level up and you get a premium version of the product. You do events, you have a community, all that sort of stuff. You create products for people who like your stuff. I'm not against doing that, but not there yet. And then the other one is something I've been quite interested in for some time, but I haven't really been able to dedicate as much time to, is like buying existing companies. So that's why I had Andrew Wilkinson on the show, Ryan Beagleman. These guys I've reached out to because I wanted to learn about that world. So I would say like the podcast can always help all of those things, whether that's consultancy, investing passively as like an angel investor essentially, or a small fund, or going down this other route. So that's kind of how I think about it.
Yeah, no, I love that. Yeah, to shed some perspective for the audience on my side, I would love to just have the podcast make enough money to cover its own burn, and just sit down for an hour a week, obviously do the prep I need to do, but then have one conversation. And after that, the team takes care of everything else, produces super high quality stuff. And then you could dedicate the other 95% of your hours to actually building businesses. That's
completely
exactly what.
So I think we're probably in the same boat. And I feel like I've got better from when I started to now. Like I hired the person to do the editing. There's other parts I could outsource, which I haven't fully yet. So, I've had on my to-do list for a long time to like work on that. And I've just got in a rhythm. So I just keep doing what I'm doing. But yeah, maybe that's something it's a good reminder that I need to do that as well.
Yeah, no, we're in the same boat.
Yeah, man.
All right, I want to ask you we call it the Startup Manifesto question. We're calling it the Creator Manifesto here, but it's the same question, and we ask this to every guest. So I'm pumped to hear your take on this one. So, if you had to write a Startup Manifesto or Creator Manifesto with 5 of the most important key lessons or pitfalls to avoid when starting out building a brand, what would it be?
Yeah, I guess, and based on what we spoke about before, the way I kind of hear that question is more around. It's like almost like my own kind of values and what I care about and how it manifests into business. So I'll just take it from that angle, if that's all right.
Yeah, it's perfect.
So the first thing, I guess, is what we talked a little bit about before, so I won't go on about it too much, but like know why you're doing something and be very clear about that, because I think that's a huge problem, meeting many people who like have seen some success, but end up being terrible in their own personal lives, mentally, psychologically, whatever. So for me, the whole point of entrepreneurship is to create a life that's interesting whether that means being a billionaire to you or having a lifestyle business or traveling, whatever that means to you, like I'm all for people defining that and evolving over time. So that's the first part. The second thing is to be even more clearer and to stack rank those things again. So make sure whenever you have thought about why you're doing things and you've got those multiple examples, know the priority list, because you're going to make 1,000 decisions every day that need to be compared to that list. And say, for example, if someone tells me I'm going to do a podcast, but you should only do, someone told me in the past, I'm only going to listen to your podcast if you do half-an-hour episodes, let's say. So in my head, I could say, okay, if I want to maximize people who listen to the show, I need to listen to this person, his user feedback or whatever. But really, what I have to go back to my list and say, well, actually, that's not the primary reason. I'm not trying to optimize for part 2 on my list. I'm optimizing for 1. And that kind of helps me navigate and make sure I'm sticking to what I'm doing and revisit that often. And what I mean by that is, forget the podcast. When you start a company and you hire people, that needs to be revisited often, because those people have their own goals and their whys and their motivation as well. So you need to keep revisiting and evolving that. The next one I'll say is what I find a lot of people is they think they have a business idea, but it's really just a product idea, right? And they don't have the problem defined properly. So I think, and there's different schools of thought on this. I had a whole hour-and-a-half conversation with Cortland Allen, the founder of Indie Hackers, on this topic around business ideas and the framework to go through that. And his part, I took this from him, is he starts with the problem. And that, again, that sounds obvious, but think about anyone who's told you they've got a business idea, right? They say, oh, I've got this idea for an app. The app's going to do X, Y, Z. That is not a business idea. That's a product idea. So starting from the problem, you're saying, I've got an app that's going to help people who are millennials to trade more efficiently, and it's going to be free. And that becomes Robinhood, right? So like, you're not starting from like what you're doing. You're starting from a real key problem, and you ideally have verified that's a real problem, because a lot of people don't do that. The next thing I'll say is like, again, this is not for everyone, but coming from my background with Google, they had this 10x moonshot thinking. But growing up, the thing that I loved the most was this Japanese Kaizen approach. So they're actually quite different. One is about 10x doing things in a completely different way. And then Kaizen is about every day you're trying to get 1% better. And the way I kind of see this is, personally, how I try to do it is 10x micro is Kaizen. So what I mean by that is, if you're starting in a new business, you're starting in a new industry, if you're thinking from first principles, and you've got a fresh pair of eyes, you can design something that's completely brand new, right? And if you look at like Square, I had the founder Square on the show, and he taught me all about this thing called the innovation stack, which was 14 parts of the Square innovation stack that allowed them to be completely cheaper than what was already out there, and how they managed to squeeze into this market, which you wouldn't think there's a market for it. So those are the things, the big innovators like SpaceX, what they've done is the 10x thinking, true 10x thinking. And then on the flip side though, on a day-to-day, your micro, when you're going to work, when you're actually creating stuff every day, like my podcast, that's the Kaizen approach. That's like, okay, today I did an interview. Now let me review how can the next one be a little bit better? Oh, I can chop this little part out. I can prepare in this way. I can be more relaxed. I can be, whatever. So to me, that's kind of like 2 levels. It's like 10x thinking on the macro, and then micro is Kaizen. And then I guess the last one I'll say is like greed, right? So this is something I probably struggled with early on. And one of my friends, Omer, who I went to university with, his dad ended up owning like one of the biggest metal, like commodity, like businesses in India or like Asia or something like that. And when I'd spoken to him through his son, he talked about like making sure whatever deals you're doing, there's room for everyone to eat, and make sure the pie is split. Because early on, when I was younger and I had basically zero money, that was where I was like trying to maximize everything. I'm like, okay, I'm not going to get screwed over. I'm going to get the bigger chunk. And over time, I've realized like, okay, that's not going to necessarily work long term. You need if you're going to do anything significant, you're going to have, employees, partners, investors, in some way, right? Even for a podcast, you've got listeners, you've got guests. So you need to be able to think from all those people's point of view, and everything you do, you need to think like, what are they getting out of this? So when I do a podcast with someone, I want to create something they're so proud of that they want to share it out with everyone, and all of us win, right? That they share it out, they look good, they get to promote their stuff. I win because it gets out to more people, and the people listening win because they got something really great. So it's just like thinking through from their point of view, I think is really important.
I love that. It's a great list packed with value. Yeah, I think of that too. My kind of, the way I approach, just to hit that last point, is I want this to be the most fun experience that the guest has, right? And not fun in the way that like we're like clowning around, but just like the questions that I ask, I like when the guests walk away and like feel good because they're recalling some stories that like were positive experiences in their life. So I'm totally aligned.
You're doing a great job, man. Like you're very like even keeled and calm, which I like. You got a good presence about you. You can tell you're listening actively as well. So
awesome.
Keep
I appreciate
that.
Dude. Awesome. All right, let's shift into just a couple quick hitters, and then we'll go to the brainstorm, and then we'll wrap up. So these are more like kind of personal questions around just the way you think about things. The first one, I call it the personal operating system. So what are kind of the tools, or it could be software, hardware, physical products, or anything, or habits that you just can't live without that just help you maximize your day-to-day?
Yeah, I mean, I'm really, like many people who listen to this, I'm sure, like obsessed about productivity and making the most of making yourself as productive as possible. But one of the things I realized was the difference between being efficient and effective. And essentially, like, yeah, we can have 100 tasks and get through them really quickly and have a process to do that. But being effective is picking the 20% of tasks that need to be done. So I'd say the first lens is looking at it from that angle. And then the second part is, okay, what I've got, can I use the tools available? Are there automations I can create? Is there software that makes this easier rather than me writing this on a piece of paper? So I can just share. I mean, I still use like the getting things done kind of approach for productivity. I don't think it's perfect, but it's the one that's always kind of stuck with me. So I generally have like an inbox to capture stuff. I use a software called Things 3. It's like costs a little bit of money, but I think it's really beautifully designed. It's on my phone and my Mac, and it works really great. And the cool thing is I can basically create different projects, and every week I'll go in and make sure the to-do list for that week is essentially, like not too many things. It might be, a couple of things every day that I can actually tackle. And and I'm definitely not perfect at it. It gets too long sometimes, and I need to purge and delete a bunch of stuff. But that's how I think about it. So I use that tool. I use Evernote still mainly for note taking. I write notes and everything. I don't love Evernote, especially the recent updates, but I've got so much stuff in there that I'm just like, okay, it works well enough, and I've tried. I have used Notion, and I think it's a pretty good software, but like it's a little bit slow sometimes, and so I use them for different things. So yeah, that's how, I've also used Airtable for stuff, and Google Sheets, obviously. So yeah, I mean, there's a company called Coda, which I actually work with, and I really like their product, but I think they're more suited for like teams, whereas for an individual, like I just need something that's already working. So I just stick to the process I've had in time for years. Was there anything else in particular you want me to share? Or
No, those were great. I love asking because I still haven't been able to find the like personal kind of like note taking, like almost like the operating system for myself. I still live out of, I use like Apple Notes, and then I use this thing called Todoist, which is just like
I used that
checklist
before as well. I used it before. I think it's pretty good. And the last thing, I've had this struggle as well. The only thing I'd add is I think what's more important than the tools are like just the way you approach them. So whether that means we're putting too many things on the list and we need to get rid of a bunch, that's probably more important than the tool. Like I spoke to Tim Urban, who's one of the best writers in the world, and he uses like text edit to write stuff, like like the basic thing, and he has like 5 of them up in one go, and it's kind of crazy to me, but it works. So I think it just depends on the person.
Yeah, it's whatever works for you. The one area that I'm still struggling to find a solve is like idea, like spontaneous idea capture. So I'll, usually when I'm working out, walking, shower, like times, usually when you're not thinking about it, that's when the best ideas come. And typically I'll pop open notes, but it's disorganized and you put it somewhere you can't capture it. So I'm still trying to find something.
I had that same problem. So I still used to put a bunch of stuff in Evernote, but what I've done is in Things, I've created a project called Ideas. So it's not ideal because they're not really ideas I'm going to check off a list, but they don't turn up in my to-do list for the week. They just show up in the inbox. So then I'll write it down pretty quickly because on the app, you can just slide over and type it really quickly. And then I put that in the ideas folder. And then I either like keep it there because I want a list in there, or I can like build on it. And the cool thing there, you can add like sub tasks. You can add like notes in there and links and stuff as well. So I find that quite a useful place to store stuff as well. But it's not perfect. Yeah.
I gotta check that out.
Check it out.
All right. So another question I love to ask founders is this idea of the wellness stack. And, I've been thinking about this for a while, probably around the same time as like Levels and 8 Sleep and all these companies came around. But this idea of compounding wellness, where you take fitness, nutrition, mindfulness, content, and you really stack them together. And if everything's working together, you get a compounding effect. And so I'd love to just hear, as much or as little as you'd like, how do you think about wellness today? And are there any specific products or routines or habits that you have for any of those wellness verticals?
Yeah, I'm definitely super into it as well, and I think you've had those guys on the show, and so have I, like 8 Sleep and Levels. I also use Aura Ring, which you can see here, which is for sleep, which I do love, but again, it's kind of just me liking the data, It's like I could still sleep great without it, but it's nice to have. So I'd say the pillar for me, the base layer for me personally is nutrition. Some other people is exercise, and I'll be frank, I struggle with the motivation to exercise right now, like in my current situation, like at home. Like I hate doing a workout at home. Like I haven't found something in the last year that I really enjoy. So that's something I've definitely struggled with. But what I found is the nutrition part, that's always been like the lead domino for me. If I can be kind of strict enough where I'm like, it's probably because I know the most about it. A few years ago, I'd lost like 50 pounds, and I'd mainly through learning all about this stuff, and I became quite extreme with it. So because of that, I feel like when I go back to that, everything else is better. So I start with that. I generally fast, like I normally eat 2 meals a day. I eat lunch like 12, 1, 2 o'clock. I have 2 meals a day. I use Zero to measure my fast, even though, again, all these things are just for fun. Like I don't think like, oh, I can't do it without it, but it's nice to have the data. I use the Fitbit for like steps and pulling that all in. I even use MyFitnessPal sometimes when I'm trying to cut, like right now, I'm trying to get rid of some of that quarantine life. So I'm like just being a little bit more mindful of that sort of stuff so I can actually be more aware of stuff. And then the sleep is, of course, really important. It's definitely harder if you're in a relationship or anything because you have to coordinate. And that has been a bit of a struggle for me, but maybe sleep is probably the most important part. But yeah, so those are all. I've used Levels. I really liked it. And for people who don't know and haven't heard that episode on either of our shows, it's a continuous glucose monitor, which measures the impact of food on glucose levels. And it's incredible. Well, not just food, anything really, but mainly food. And that was incredible insight because I started to see, oh man, like I just have white rice and it just sets me off. And like I'm Pakistani, like we ate that like 3 days a week, and chapati roti the other 3-4 days a week. So like my dad's a diabetic, and even being able to share that with him is really useful. So yeah, man, I don't know if that answered your question, but I try to start with the nutrition side and everything else builds on top of that. I'd say sleep next. Exercise, I still have a lot of work to do on. But I try to, I pretty much still measure my weight and body fat every day on the scales that I have, the Fitbit, whatever it's called, Aria or something. And again, mainly just because I like to see it. And if you were on my phone right now, I have like a whole folder full of like, you can see it here, health, like a bunch of stuff in there, which is like Aura Ring, Fitbit, Apple Health, all these different things. So I think it's great to have these tools, but again, similar to before, it's really about like what is simple for you to do, and realistically, what do you enjoy enough to stick to? Because that's what has been a struggle for me. Like, I don't like doing push-ups on the floor in my bedroom, to be honest. So I like playing sports, so it's like maybe I need to find ways to integrate that more often. So
Yeah, no, I love it. So I've got something for you for the fitness. So have you heard of Future?
No, but I just literally saw it today from someone else. So I check it out. What is it, like at-home workouts, or what is it?
Yeah, so I've got a free month I'll send you, and they give me 2 passes, so I'll send you one. Basically, it's one-on-one remote personal training.
Oh,
that's
damn.
affordable. So basically what they figured out is they were like, okay, and the founder, you maybe should look at getting him on the show. He's a legacy, Silicon Valley guy, really sharp guy. And if you want a teaser, we just released that episode this week. But
cool.
Basically,
sorry, that's where I heard it. I was listening to it on your show, like a few. I think I just listened to a part of it when you released it.
Yeah, he's awesome. And basically, what they did is they were like, what do the celebrities and pro athletes and business executives do to keep their fitness? And that most people fall off, but they don't. They all outsource to world-class coaches.
Yeah.
So he was basically thinking, how can we take world-class coaching, match you by personality, and then give that to everybody at a price point that makes sense? Yeah. And so it's basically, it's $5 a day. So $150 a month when you're paying, which is definitely too expensive for some people, but much more approachable than paying like $100 a session or whatever people pay.
Which you're doing if you're paying for someone. Yeah, completely.
And so you can tell them, so I have a trainer on Future, and basically I said, like, I was working out 5 days a week, I was lifting 4 days a week, and I was taking a couple off. I want some kind of movement 7 days a week, and you can feel free to build in like 2 softer days, but then the other days, like, I want you to push me. And so, and like if you're traveling, I tell them, hey, I'm going to be gone these days. I'm only going to have body weight available. Or if I'm in the gym, so they really customize it every single day. Yeah, so I'll send you a pass.
I'll check it out for sure. That's cool. Yeah. Thanks for sharing, man.
For sure. All right, so this is the last question, then we'll get you out of here. I know we're going a bit long,
I'm enjoying it.
But I think I love this conversation. So it's really the brainstorm. So this is my my attempt at trying to infuse a little My First Million into the show, which that's my favorite podcast.
Yeah, they're great. I love it as well.
Yeah, so let's go into a little bit of a brainstorm. So what's kind of one other idea that really excites you right now? We can riff on it a little bit.
Yeah, so the idea I thought of was actually based on something I tried doing 10 plus years ago. So before I joined Google, I was trying to build a platform for entrepreneurs and investors to meet each other, which is basically AngelList now, right? And I was thinking about this idea. And then yesterday I saw someone else tweet something similar to this. So I'll give credit. It was the Morning Brew guy, Alex, who's also coming on my show. But yeah, it was a similar idea to what I had. And it's essentially a live Shark Tank where the audience can invest. And so if you think of like Shark Tank, the show meets like HQ Trivia, Robinhood, QVC, that's kind of like how I was thinking about it. And again, I don't know if maybe someone's already doing this, but I haven't seen it. And I just love the idea of the fact that you could have something that a lot of people like watching passively, but getting people involved. And I think we're now getting to a stage where there are the tools to allow for that to happen. I also think we've moved away from everything being on demand. I think there's an appetite for people to feel connected in a moment. I think Clubhouse is showing that, especially right now when we're not seeing people. So I think that's another big trend. And then the third big trend is really around something I wish was more available is these deals are normally only available to accredited investors who are high net worth individuals. So I think there already is legislation that's being passed through slowly that would allow, retail investors to be able to invest in stuff if they show they're sophisticated enough. This is also contrasting the Robinhood stuff and the Wall Street Bet stuff. So I understand there's 2 sides to this, but I would love that if someone who's sophisticated enough, who's put in time, they might have like hundreds of thousands of dollars to invest, but they're not technically at the level of an accredited investor. So I can just share, even for me, like I've been in a situation where I was previously, but then when you leave your job and you don't have an income and that's what they're using, then you're not eligible anymore. So I was like, okay, now how do I get around this? So I just think there's people like me who would love to invest in certain things, and I'm not at the moment for that reason. So I think that's the kind of concept, whether that would be something that's live on Twitch or Clubhouse or whatever. But I love this idea of like a live interactive pitching show where people can invest from the audience.
That would be fascinating. I think that broader concept of democratizing access to the private markets for the everyday investor, who is like takes a test or whatever, is fascinating. And I think you're right. Like there's so many people, me included. There's so many of these companies that, I mean, you and I see kind of early stage in some cases because we talk to these founders that I would love to come into those Series C, Series A rounds, even if it's a small check. And we just can't. Like the legislation prevents us from doing that.
And also, when you're grouping that group together, you can have the equivalent of what is fractional shares for Robinhood or whatever. You could let someone invest $1,000 or $200 versus 25K, 50K, 100, which is normally what happens. So this is definitely happening to a certain extent, again, with like syndicates, there's rolling funds, but they're not exactly the same thing. So this would require quite a lot of work. It would require a lot of work on the diligence side, the software to allow that to happen. But, we're brainstorming. So I think it's a cool idea.
Yeah, no, there's definitely a long ways to go. So I think the crowd investing platforms have been the closest way to this. But my qualm with those has been you don't really get the A deals on those platforms. Like and rarely do companies, A level companies, need to go on there. So that prevents that use case from working fully. I think if you think about it, like Josh from Levels or Matteo from 8 Sleep, I mean, they would love to fill out a portion of their round with thousands of people that are, I mean, if you're high net worth enough to invest, you likely have some kind of network.
Yeah, completely. What I like about it is beyond just the money, because if you think even for an investor, like if you think of the leading investors now, there's a lot of money out there. Like, if you've got something really good, you're going to be able to get money a lot of the time. And those investors are competing and they're saying, well, why should you take my check versus so-and-so down the road in Sandhill or whatever. So I think this is interesting because what is becoming more and more of a currency is an audience. So you're combining not just an audience where people are coming to learn about products, where you basically get to pitch your stuff, but you also got investors in the crowd who are able to actually give you money and become customers at the same time. So if you think of YC Demo Day, Y Combinator Demo Day, but with thousands of people or tens of thousands of people watching and actually investing, I think that's quite an interesting concept. So yeah, it would be really cool to do something like that.
Do you think it ever pushes to a point where traditional VCs are more irrelevant, if not completely extinct per se? Do you think that it gets that far?
I think I don't know about like complete extinct, but I think there's an evolution where even the VCs, is a broader macro trend of people not trusting institutions, whether that's the government, whether that's traditional media, and then transitioning to trusting individuals. So even if I'm Josh from Levels, like he's got the pick of his investors because what he's doing is so unique and cool. He can go and say, I'm going to get investment from X VC, but it's not even about the brand only. It's about who's leading it from that place, right? And I think a lot of the time, even if you look at what like Chamath is doing in his side, like people are investing in him. Like they're not really talking about the rest of the exec team he works with. They're like, oh, I trust him. I like what he stands for. I'm going to jump on that rocket ship. And I think we're seeing that again even further with rolling funds. Sahil, Sean Puri, Pomp, like these people have built audiences. People trust them in a certain area, and they'll say, okay, well, they're getting access to this deal flow that I'm not getting. Let me just go and join what they're doing. But it's not a big institution, right? It's like these individuals with a piece of software designed by AngelList where people can drop in money, and now you've got something with millions of dollars ready to invest. So I think if you take that to another level and add in that audience layer, that's kind of a cool concept.
Yeah, I love it, man. We could riff forever, but I want to get you out of here. So before I let you go, I just want to acknowledge you for a second. So,
thanks, man.
I'm obviously a huge fan of your show. I'm hosting this, but I'm also just soaking up all the lessons learned. I think for people listening, you've given such tactical insight and advice, and you always do that on all of your episodes. But
thanks, man.
I'm so appreciative of that, and I just want to say thanks so much for coming on. Everybody go check out Creator Lab, and looking forward to doing this again sometime.
I appreciate it, man. Yeah, I love what you're doing. I think you've got a great style, and I can see you take it really seriously, man. So that's it's great to see, and I appreciate you having me on. Oh, actually, one thing I will add, actually, for people listening, is if you haven't heard the show, Creator Lab, I would say I might recommend a couple episodes to start with, because there's a bunch there. So if you're interested, check out the ones with Sam Parr from The Hustle. If you like the brainstorming part, he just sold his company for reported 27-30 million to HubSpot. Sean Puri was also on the show, where we brainstormed stuff and went through a bunch of frameworks. The episodes with Tim Urban, Jack Butcher, and Pomp are also really popular. But yeah, there's so many great people on there. I'm sure you'll find something. And if you like this, I would love to hear from you. Just tweet me as well at Zaidi, and tag us both and let us know what you thought of this. It'll be nice to know.
Yeah, I've listened. I can confirm. I've listened to most of those, and they're great episodes. So
thanks, man.
Would love that. Bilal Zaidi, founder of Creator Lab. Thank you so much for coming on the show.
Thanks, brother. Thanks for having me.